Hi there, this is Dr. Maria with mycustomherbs.com, and we're embarking on another little video series. Sorry, I've been gone for a little while, but we're back at it. And so this is going to be focused on what is known as the microbiome, which is basically a party of little microorganisms that live in our gut. And so in part one, I'm going to introduce you to these microorganisms and where they live and what I mean by microorganisms. And then in other parts of this series, we'll get into why they're there, what they're doing for us. They have an enormous impact on our health, like contributing to our mood and our immune system and our digestive function. We'll get into the things that influence who is living in our gut. And so hopefully you stay with us on this next video series. So moving into the microbiome, this is often referred to as well as our gut flora and such. But to be clear, we are loaded with microorganisms. We're covered on our skin. We're covered on all of our mucous membranes with different species of microbes. And so by microbe, I mean bacteria, like this little blue guy in the upper left corner. And I mean fungi, like this yeast in the upper right-hand corner. And I mean viruses, like the guy in the lower right-hand corner, as well as, and so animal viruses that infect us, but even our bacteria have viruses. So there's what's known as a bacteriophage here in the lower left corner. That looks a little bit like the lunar lander. They're kind of weird looking and a little creepy looking, actually. So even our bacteria get infected. And so these are the various things that live in and on us. And hopefully that doesn't skeeve you out if you are a little bit queasy, but it's a fact, and they're actually really important for our health. People are often used to thinking of things like bacteria and yeasts and viruses as pathogens, and many of them are, but a lot of them are actually just part of who we are, part of our normal little ecological system. And so of these organisms, the ones that inhabit us by far in number are the bacteria. Although you could argue that maybe the bacterial viruses or bacteriophages could perhaps be even more numerous. But I'm taking a guess on that. But we have a lot of bacteria in and on our body. And, just to geek out, there are as many bacterial cells in and on us as there are our own cells. And so the only reason we don't have a big body-sized pile of bacteria that accompanies us everywhere is that they're really small. And in fact, even though there are about the same number of bacterial cells as our own cells that we're walking around with, they weigh only about 1/4 of a pound. Although, to be honest, 1/4 of a pound is a heck of a lot of bacteria, and it actually would be a little gross to see that. Most of the bacteria that we carry with us, and indeed a lot of the microbes in general that we carry with us, are in our gut. They're in our large intestine. But before we get to that, I want to make it clear that they're actually all throughout our digestive tract, from mouth to butt. And so if you look at the mouth, there are a whole bunch of species of bacteria and fungi that live there. And then whatever bacterial viruses happen to reside in the bacteria there. So here's Milo, the test dog here, showing us his mouth, and all sorts of species here. You might have heard of Streptococcus or strep. Some species of this are the causative agents of strep throat, but it's not unusual to have strep in the mouth of various species. Candida, many of you have heard of Candida. This is a yeast. It's also a common resident in our mouth. And when it gets a little out of control or overgrown, that's known as thrush. If you've had children, might have encountered that in your little ones, but it can happen even in adults as well. And there are all sorts of other species here. These are just some of the more well-known ones. And you don't have to worry about this if you don't give a hoot about microbiology. But for those of you who are a bit geekier, like I am, and who may in fact be a microbiologist like I am, I just thought I'd point out some of the more predominant species that have been identified in the mouth and elsewhere in the GI tract. Now, moving down the line, we have the esophagus, which is the tube that connects the mouth to our stomach. Some similar species found in the esophagus as to those found in the mouth. And that's maybe not surprising, given that, one, they're connected, and two, we're constantly swallowing things like our spit and our foods and our beverages. So maybe it's not a big revelation that a lot of the same species are also found in our esophagus. Now, moving even further down the line, here is our stomach, our happy little stomach here. There are even bacteria living in the stomach, and that used to be thought not to be the case because the stomach is so acidic. People used to assume that stuff couldn't live there, but we know better now. And there are actually a handful of species that live in the stomach that aren't unusual to be found living in the stomach. And one of them you may have heard of is H. pylori, or Helicobacter pylori. This is actually the causative agent of ulcers and also one of the precipitating factors for the development of stomach cancer, Helicobacter pylori, but it's frequently found as a resident in the stomach. Then moving even further down the line, we get to the small intestine, where we have a whole slew of species here. Clostridium is one, strep is also here as well. There are at least a couple of different species of yeast, such as Candida and Saccharomyces. And again, as with the stomach, it used to be thought that the small intestine was more or less sterile, or relatively sterile, but we're finding out that that is not the case. There are actually resident microbes that live in the small intestine and serve various functions there. But again, by far the most species, the most, basically a number, microbes live in the large intestine. And as I said at the beginning, about 70% of our flora, our little hitchhikers, live in the large intestine. And there are all kinds of species here: Bacteroides, Prevotella, multiple kinds of fungi like Candida and Saccharomyces and other type of yeast, and even the fungus known as Penicillium. And if that name sounds familiar to you, it's because the antibiotic penicillin was originally identified and isolated from a fungus. And so lots and lots of stuff going on in our large intestine, a veritable party of microbes going on there. And so what we'll get into next time, after this hopefully brief introduction, is why they're there and what are they doing, what's going on in that microbial party in our gut. And so stay tuned, and hopefully I'll get that next video churned out pretty soon for you to continue our microbial geekery here. And until then, be well.